Welcome back and congratulations. You've made it to the final lecture in our course on engaging with and writing about anything. Along the way, we discussed the different styles of writing, from poetry to prose to drama and beyond. And we talked about the specific expectations that we bring to both reading and writing about these kinds of texts. We've explored the basics of making an argument, seen how the principles of classical rhetoric can be applied to writing today in useful and productive ways, and we learned the basics of conducting research responsibly. We've also discussed strategies for overcoming the dreaded writer's block, and we've gone step by step through the process of editing and rewriting an essay. We examined 10 common grammatical and mechanical errors, learned why they're both so common and so wrong, and we discussed key ways to avoid them. You've taken away lots of information, I'm sure, from all of these lectures, but if I had to give you one piece of advice for becoming a more engaged reader and a more effective writer, it's simply to read and to write as much as you can. All right, maybe that's two things if you want to get really technical about it, but really, reading and writing go hand in hand, and when you think of them as a symbiotic process, you'll find that your own writing and reading skills improve dramatically. When I began this lecture series, I started with an example of appallingly bad writing. You may recall that this passage was from the annual Bulwer-Lytton contest, and it was written so that it was deliberately bad. So bad, in fact, that it won a prize for badness. What I would like to do today in this final lecture is leave you with some examples of wonderful writing in the hope that they inspire you to keep up the practice of writing and reading long after this course is over. I've chosen 3 selections that I think are particularly fine examples of the genres to which they belong, and I'd like to start with the opening of the American classic Walden by Henry David Thoreau, a text that is, in some respects, both essay and autobiography, and which we talked about a little bit earlier in the course. Here are the opening lines. When I wrote the following pages, or rather, the bulk of them, I lived alone, in the woods, a mile from any neighbor, in a house which I had built myself, on the shore of Walden Pond, in Concord, Massachusetts, and earned my living by the labor of my hands only. I lived there 2 years and 2 months. At present, I am a sojourner in civilized life again. Now, Thoreau is not often given credit for the beauty or the lyricism of his prose, probably because most readers are drawn to his work by the ideas he expresses rather than the manner by which or in which he expresses them. The Thoreau most people know and understand is primarily a thinker and an activist. His status as a writer is something of a secondary concern, if it's a concern at all. But this passage, the opening paragraph of his most famous work, Walden, is among the most carefully crafted pieces of writing you'll find in all of American literature. It's not only a lucid summary of the book's content, but it's also a really elegant reflection of its overall structure. In other words, you can find in these few lines a microcosm of the most intriguing and most important ideas that Walden as a whole has to offer. And it's also a model of the form that those offerings take. If you studied this one part long enough, you would be able to get a view of the whole of Walden, in other words. Moreover, the passage provides a kind of guide for how to read Walden insofar as it establishes the terms of the relationship between narrator and reader, and it also mirrors the relationship between Thoreau and the social world from which he partially and temporarily withdrew during those 2 years and 2 months on the shores of Walden Pond. Let's start by looking at that sense of partial and temporary withdrawal, because for many scholars, it's the most important thematic dimension of Walden. While many people think of Thoreau as withdrawing from the world because he wanted to get away from its burdens and preoccupations, it's also true that his larger purpose in getting away, just partially and temporarily, was to better understand those burdens and the preoccupations that go along with them by giving himself a new relationship to them, one that involved less participation and more observation. But his goal was never to suspend his participation in his previous life entirely. It was never to break away completely from the social world and the physical environment of Concord. Indeed, aside from his college years in Cambridge, some trips to Maine and Cape Cod, and a few lecture tours that took him to various other parts of New England, Thoreau spent most of his life, just as he wrote most of his pages, within a 10-mile radius of Concord and Walden Pond. His purpose was not to leave his home environment, but rather to give himself a chance to view and experience it from a position that was slightly and temporarily what we might call off-center. We can think of Thoreau as wanting to hold his life in Concord at arm's length, not breaking away from his hometown, but methodically distancing himself from it while still remaining in relatively close proximity. And we can see this in the content and the structure of those opening lines. Each detail builds on the next to tell us something more about how he removed himself from his previous life, yet how these details are held together like links in a chain, how each phrase is discrete, but it's connected, it's bound to all the others by a series of commas to form a single, complete sentence. So it creates a sense of distance and it creates a sense of connection all at the same time. The very structure of that sentence compels us to recognize the narrator's desire and Thoreau's desire to maintain a link to the world while, as I said, holding it at arm's length. Listen to the opening sentence again and pay attention to the pauses that indicate there's a comma, a pause, a subclause. When I wrote the following pages, or rather the bulk of them, I lived alone in the woods, a mile from any neighbor, in a house which I had built myself, on the shore of Walden Pond, in Concord, Massachusetts, and earned my living by the labor of my hands only. The sentence leads you on, but it also holds you back at the same time, deferring your arrival at the conclusion. The remove is not permanent, though. Just as the conclusion of Walden advises readers to break away from their own social worlds so they can learn something new about them, and then return back so they can report what they've learned, so too does the opening paragraph emphasize the need to eventually lessen that distance and ultimately re-engage with the social world. Consider again those last two lines. I lived there 2 years and 2 months. At present, I am a sojourner in civilized life again. Finally, this structural pattern of the opening lines, carefully marking out a series of steps that take one away from that which is known and familiar, and then, eventually an acknowledgement of the need to turn back around again and look at the familiar with new eyes, it is itself a guide for how to read Walden. Each chapter, and all the chapters taken together, follow a similar pattern. A deliberate movement outward and away from the status quo, away from that which is recognizable and easily comprehended, followed eventually by a return to the same territory where we started. Yet because of the removal and displacement we've experienced, we're now sojourners with a different feel for the ground we've walked before. Thoreau's piece is a masterful example of engaging an audience, drawing them along, but simultaneously holding them at arm's length. He conveys to his audience his main argument not just in the content of his words, but in the style with which he executes his argument. Another writer who plays with audience expectations is William Shakespeare, perhaps the greatest writer of the English language to ever hold a pen. Even if you have never studied drama or poetry in any sort of formal way, everyone is probably at least familiar with the idea of who Shakespeare was and that he was a creative genius. You're also probably familiar with some of the most common cliches in love poetry, Namely, when a poet describes his beloved, he compares her to all sorts of beautiful flowers or jewels or fruits, things like that. We've all heard someone with red lips being described as having ruby lips or having cheeks the color of ripe apples, eyes like two limpid pools of blue water, etc., etc. During Shakespeare's day, this style of writing and describing the beloved was so common that there's actually a name for it, the blason, which is a word that signifies this is a poem describing a woman's beauty using poetic devices. In Shakespeare's sonnet number 130, the poet plays with this idea, and he cleverly turns it on its head and still manages to compliment his beloved. Shakespeare wrote a series of sonnets that follow a progression, and we could spend days just talking about this. But what I do think is important here today is that we know that the sonnet is a stylized form. In other words, there's a pattern or a rhyme scheme that the author has to work with. But in this case, as you'll see, the constraints of the form allow Shakespeare to really show his skill. As many of you know, the Shakespearean sonnet is 14 lines long, and it has a rhyme pattern of A, B, C, D, E, F, G, G. And it's proper and common to speak of the Shakespearean sonnet as being broken down into 3 quatrains and 1 couplet. The main idea of the sonnet, or what scholars call a conceit, is used throughout the poem, but there's a shift in emphasis from quatrain to quatrain, and the move to the final rhyming couplet is called the turn, where the whole poem is given new meaning by what those final 2 lines say. Here's the poem I want you to consider, and the first time through I'm going to read it in its entirety. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. In this poem, Shakespeare begins with a series of images that are truly startling and unexpected considering the time in which he composed this poem. Hey, he says, my beloved doesn't have lips as red as coral. She doesn't have eyes that shine like the sun, and her hair is kind of wiry, and her complexion is not perfect. As readers at this point, we're startled into surprise at the juxtaposition of the word mistress, someone who is beloved, in combination with these negative assessments of her appearance. A mistress is the woman that you love, and usually, as they say, you'd expect a man to find his beloved beautiful. In the second quatrain, Shakespeare shifts the emphasis a bit, and he makes it specifically about what he sees and thinks. The word I is used here several times. He says, for example, I have seen roses damasked, red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. In each of these 2 lines, he starts with something beautiful or pleasant, roses or perfume, and then when he makes the comparison to the mistress, the poem moves to negative words, describing her breath as reeking, for example. In the third quatrain, he shifts his voice to start to suggest that he loves his mistress despite all these poetic shortcomings. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. This sets us up just a little bit for what comes with the final turn of the poem to the rhyming couplet. And yet, By heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. In other words, he loves his mistress and she is a real woman. What he's saying seems to be all these poetic devices and elaborate comparisons of women with jewels, with the natural world, with music, with perfume, it doesn't mean anything if the love is not real. His love, he assures us, is real. And it's not just that he's saying that his mistress lacks these poetic attributes, but more than that, he's actually saying that all real women do as well. And the poems that others compose that make use of this exaggerated, overblown comparison of a beloved's appearance to rubies and oceans and flowers, he's saying that those poems are insincere. So Shakespeare manages to critique and satirize this poetic form, even as he demonstrates that he's the best at it. This sonnet and the others in his sonnet sequence yield even greater treasures and pleasures the more you read and reread them. And I hope if you've never read Shakespeare before, or if you have and it's just been some time since you read through his sonnet sequence, I hope that you take a look at his writing to appreciate how masterful it is, how he holds on to a single idea throughout a sonnet while making it part of a larger whole of a sequence, and how within a single sonnet he moves to differently nuanced treatments of that main idea as he goes from quatrain to quatrain with a final surprise or a ta-da at the end. So far, we've talked about an example of great writing from the genre of the essay and from the genre of poetry. As our final example of great writing in today's lecture, I want to share a piece of writing from a specific subgenre of nonfiction writing, and that's the obituary. On more than one occasion in this course, I've asked you either to think about or attempt to write an obituary. And this can be a very useful exercise, as obituaries demand a certain approach, and the expectation is that they will contain certain kinds of information. How old was the person who died? What members of his or her family survive? Where's the memorial service? What were the important accomplishments of his or her life, etc., etc. Obituary writing can be some of the most basic, uninspiring writing you'll ever read, but as my friend and colleague Porter Shreve's first novel, The Obituary Writer, proves, it can also be some of the most interesting. So I want to close our examples of fine writing today with an obituary that moves far beyond the level of interesting and I think actually rises to the level of magnificence. All the important details are included. The heading tells us when and at what age a man named Bill Millen died. But instead of a catalog of a life, we get a truly moving story that brings a lump to the throat because it is so beautifully written and it's true. Here is how the obituary of Bill Millen, which appeared in The Economist on August 26, 2010, begins. Any reasonable observer might have thought Bill Millen was unarmed as he jumped off the landing ramp at Sword Beach in Normandy on June 6, 1944. Unlike his colleagues, the pale 21-year-old held no rifle in his hands. Of course, in full Highland rig as he was, he had his trusty skene-dhu, his little dirk, tucked in his right sock. But that was soon under 3 feet of water as he waded ashore, a weary soldier still smelling his own vomit from a night in a close boat on a choppy sea, and whose kilt in the freezing water was floating prettily around him like a ballerina's skirt. But Mr. Millen was not unarmed. Far from it. He held his pipes, high over his head at first to keep them from the wet, for while whiskey was said to be good for the bag, salt water wasn't. Then cradled in his arms to play, and bagpipes, by long tradition, counted as instruments of war. What this obituary writer has done has taken the most fascinating, compelling moment of this man's life, and he did live to be 88, and the obituary writer starts there. And for anyone who remembers what it was like to live through World War II and hear stories of the Normandy landing, and even for those of us too young to remember but who are old enough to know someone who did, or even for those of us who've just studied this event in school, the place and time where the obituary begins grabs your attention and commands that it stay right where it is. And notice, it doesn't read like a summary. We don't get, Bill Millen was present at the Normandy invasion on Sword Beach, where he famously played his bagpipes. That statement is no match for the vivid description of the cold water, his kilt floating like a ballerina's skirt, the smell of vomit left over from seasickness, and the image of Millen holding the bagpipes over his head so that they didn't get wet. For many of us, we're hooked by the fact that in the age of modern warfare, a bagpiper, dressed in full regalia from an earlier time, was even there amidst the mortars and the gunfire. The words of this obituary create an image stunning in its contrast and its anachronism. And even better, if you read the obituary in the magazine, it's accompanied by an actual photo of Millen as he prepared to go ashore, the bagpipes held over his head. Still, the writing is so good, we don't even need the photo. The writer has given us an indelible image to hold in our minds. As the obituary continues, it's so fascinating that it's hard to believe that this is real life and not a novel. The writer tells us how, during basic training, this lower-class, blue-collar guy, Bill Millen, became friends with the aristocratic Lord Lovat, a noble Scotsman with a castle or two who would be leading the 1st Special Service Brigade. Lord Lovat also seems, in the best tradition of British eccentricity, to be slightly off his rocker. And it was his idea that pipes would lead the invasion when the Allied forces waded ashore. The writer, after having given us this information, continues the obituary, picking up the action once they were on shore, when Lord Lovat says, quote, "Give us a tune, piper." Mr. Millen thought him a mad bastard. The man beside him, on the point of jumping off, had taken a bullet in the face and gone under. But there was Lovat, strolling through fire quite calmly in his aristocratic way, allegedly wearing a monogrammed white pullover under his jacket and carrying an ancient Winchester rifle. So, Mr. Millen struck up Highland Laddie. Lovat approved it with a thumbs up. And then he asked for The Road to the Isles. Mr. Millen inquired, half joking, whether he should walk up and down in the traditional way of pipers. "Oh yes, that would be lovely." At this moment, as you're reading, you really can't help but smile at the aristocratic leader who's strolling casually through gunfire with an antique weapon and who is more concerned with which song the piper's going to play next, it seems. The obituary writer has us firmly in his or her pocket, and I wish I knew who it was, but all writing in The Economist is anonymous. But it's also some of the best writing you'll ever read in your life, and I would highly encourage you to check out The Economist, particularly its book reviews and obituaries, which have some of the most moving, interesting writing I've ever come across. And so at this point in the obituary, now that we really can't stop reading, the writer deftly moves from the humorous to the serious. After Lord Lovat's suggestion that Millen walk while he piped, the writer tells us this. Quote, "3 times, therefore, he walked up and down at the edge of the sea. He remembered the sand shaking under his feet from mortar fire and the dead bodies rolling in the surf against his legs. For the rest of the day, whenever required, he played. He piped the advancing troops along the raised road by the Caen Canal, seeing the flashes from the rifle of a sniper about 100 yards ahead. He took them across 2 bridges, one, later renamed the Pegasus Bridge, ringing and banging as shrapnel hit the metal sides. All the way, he learned later, German snipers had him in their sights, but out of pity for this madman, had not fired. Here, the obituary writer reminds us of the high cost of war, of the human loss and suffering. Although this man survived, so many did not. I don't think the image of a piper dressed in his kilt, walking and playing while dead bodies wash against his legs is one any one of us is going to forget anytime soon. And the detail about the German snipers not firing, it's a tiny bit of fair play in what was otherwise such a horrific experience for so many. This little detail gives one kind of hope for humanity, even at what is arguably the moment of its darkest expression. The obituary concludes with a few details about Millen's life after the war. Surely, although this is the most interesting part of his life, we do want to know what he did afterward. And then the obituary writer ties things together with a perfect touch that seems as if it was scripted in a movie. Although Millen survived the war, he tells us that alas, the pipes did not, taking a direct hit at some point after the initial successful invasion. Then the writer finishes the obituary with this. And here when he starts out, he's talking about the pipes. The last tune they had piped on D-Day was The Nut Brown Maiden, played for a small, red-haired French girl who, with her folks cowering behind her, had asked him for music as he passed their farm. He gave the pipes later to the museum at the Pegasus Bridge, which he often revisited, and sometimes piped across during his long and quiet post-war career as a mental nurse at Dawlish in Devon. On one such visit, in full Highland rig, with his pipes in his arms, he was approached by a smartly dressed woman of a certain age with faded red hair who planted a joyous kiss of remembrance on his cheek. That last detail about a little red-haired girl grown into a woman who never forgot the kindness of the gift of music in the middle of war brings a lump to the throat and a tear to the eye. And it's yet another indelible image that this masterful writer creates, and which those of us lucky to hear or read this piece will not soon forget. This is great writing, and I might never have seen it if my father had not given me a gift subscription to The Economist a few years ago. I'm an English professor, and matters of economics, unless it's medieval economics, are usually not high on my list of things that I'd like to pay attention to or read about. I still remember the day I read that obituary. It moved me so much that I immediately went to my computer and, using the internet, tried to find out more about Millen, about the wonderfully eccentric Lord Lovat, about the tradition of Scottish bagpiping, about the relationship between Scots and English, about other landings on that day at Normandy. In other words, really good writing can inspire you to read more, to learn more, to engage more with your world. If you really want to be an astute, engaged reader and writer, then my best piece of advice would be promiscuous. Read everything you can. Write whenever you can. You can make yourself a beautiful space in which to write with a special desk, a lamp, paper, a special pen. But sometimes, while this approach can be a way of claiming, I am a writer, this is what I do, it can also be intimidating and prevent you from getting started. Write with a pen or a pencil, on the computer, on the back of an envelope. Read everything you can, editorials, short stories, histories, biographies, novels, poems, plays. The world around us is filled with words. Take in as many as you can, and then give us some back.